The drive through the winding hills of Vermont had always comforted Ethan Marlowe as a boy. Rolling fields, the smell of pine, the golden blaze of maple leaves in autumn. But today, the colors looked too bright against the gray that weighed on his chest. The tires crunched on the gravel as he pulled into the driveway of the farmhouse he hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. The old wind chime hanging from the porch swayed in the light breeze, its hollow notes whispering memories that stirred uneasily inside him. The house hadn't changed, the same white shutters, the same ivy crawling halfway up the stone chimney. But everything felt different. The heart of the home, his father, was gone. Ethan stepped out of the car and took a breath that caught halfway down his throat. He adjusted his coat collar and walked toward the porch, suitcase in hand. The door opened before he could knock. Claire stood in the threshold, arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the warm knit sweater she wore. She looked as if she hadn't slept. Her chestnut hair was pulled back loosely, and her eyes, usually bright and quick to smile, held a glassy distance. "Ethan," she said softly, as if trying the sound of his name after a long silence. "You made it." He offered a slight nod, managing a forced smile. "Of course." They stood awkwardly, a gulf of 3 years and a fresh loss between them. Then, almost automatically, Claire stepped forward and embraced him. Her arms were warm, familiar, but it still startled him. The hug lingered a second too long before she stepped back. "I've got your old room ready," she said, voice gentle, but strained. "And there's tea in the kitchen, if you're up for it." He nodded again and followed her inside, suitcase trailing behind him like a shadow. The air inside smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood smoke, familiar, comforting. But as Ethan stepped into the house, he saw the absence everywhere. The framed photo taken down from the mantel, the empty leather chair by the fireplace, the muted hush that hung in the space like a held breath. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. She poured the tea carefully, fingers trembling slightly. Steam curled upward, catching the late afternoon light. Ethan watched her, noting the way her eyes never quite met his. She was beautiful, still, in the way a porcelain vase might be. Lovely and delicate, but as if she might crack if touched too suddenly. "I didn't expect you to come so soon," she said, breaking the silence. "I figured you could use the help," Ethan replied, wrapping his hands around the mug. "Dad wouldn't have wanted you to deal with all this alone." Claire gave a soft, bitter laugh. "That sounds like him." A pause hung between them, long and weighted. "How are you holding up?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if he wanted the honest answer. She looked at him then, eyes searching his face as if looking for something familiar in the grown man before her. "I have good days, and then some days I walk into a room and forget he's gone. It hits me all over again." Ethan looked down at his tea. "Yeah, same." There was more he wanted to say, but the words knotted in his throat. Instead, he let the silence return, safe and heavy. That night, as he unpacked in his old room, still lined with baseball posters and dusty trophies, he noticed a photo tucked into the mirror's edge. It was a picture of all 3 of them at a 4th of July picnic years ago. His father had his arm around Claire, and Claire was laughing at something Ethan had said. She looked happy, young, alive. Now she looked like a ghost of herself, still elegant, still composed, but haunted. As the house settled around him with the creaks of old wood and shifting memories, Ethan lay on his childhood bed and stared at the ceiling. He had expected sadness, expected to mourn his father. But he hadn't expected this feeling. The strange pull whenever Claire looked at him too long. The ache that twisted in his chest when her voice softened just so. He told himself it was grief, confusion, displacement. But something unspoken was growing beneath the surface, and he wasn't sure he was ready to name it. The next morning, mist curled in through the windows like a hush that hadn't lifted since the funeral. Ethan found Claire at the dining room table, papers spread around her like a battlefield, folders labeled estate, will, house deed, all in his father's careful handwriting. She wore a thin robe over her clothes, barefoot, with her hair falling in soft waves around her face. The quiet intimacy of the scene caught Ethan off guard. He cleared his throat. "You're up early." Claire looked up, startled, then offered, a tired smile. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd try to get a head start on this mess." Ethan joined her at the table. For a while, neither of them said much, just shuffled papers, read legal clauses, signed where the lawyer had flagged. It was mechanical, but the weight behind every word made the air heavy. At one point, as they both reached for the same envelope, their hands brushed. Claire didn't pull away immediately. Ethan's fingers curled ever so slightly as if they might hold hers if given permission. She moved first. "Sorry," she said softly. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Not really. That touch lingered long after the envelope had been opened. By the third day, the rhythm of the house had settled into a quiet routine. Breakfast, legal paperwork, sorting through old boxes in the attic, awkward silences, lingering glances. Ethan tried not to look at her too long when she stood by the window in the morning light, sipping tea with her sweater draped off one shoulder. He reminded himself, she was his stepmother. She'd helped raise him. But the way his heart tightened, when she smiled at him now, it wasn't the same as before. Late that afternoon, while sifting through a worn cedar chest full of old photo albums, Ethan found a faded snapshot. Him at 17, covered in paint, standing beside Claire in the backyard. They were laughing. His dad wasn't in that photo. He remembered that day. It had been just the two of them repainting the shed. His father had promised to help but disappeared into work. Again. Claire stayed. She wore jeans and a tank top and had paint on her face by noon. They'd argued over music, shared a soda, and when he told her about a fight he'd had at school, she listened like it actually mattered. That was the day she told him, "You're more grown up than your father knows." That stuck with him. It still did. "Find something?" Claire asked, leaning over his shoulder. He handed her the photo. She smiled, a wistful glint in her eyes. "God, that was a hot summer. You gave me the worst sunburn of my life. You insisted we paint during peak sunlight. You were the one who wouldn't stop spraying me with the hose." They laughed, real laughter, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. The years between now and that summer vanished. They were two people again, sharing a moment that didn't belong to anyone else. Their eyes met, and Ethan forgot to breathe. Claire was the one to break the gaze. "I should start dinner." That night, the scent of rosemary chicken and garlic filled the kitchen. Claire poured them each a glass of wine, and they ate across from one another at the smaller breakfast table. The dining room felt too formal, too filled with ghosts. "It's strange," Claire said, swirling her wine. "How quiet the house is now. When your father was here, even in silence, it felt different. Heavy, but not empty." Ethan nodded, chewing slowly. "I loved him," she continued. "But we drifted. You were young, but I think you knew." "I did." Claire's gaze lingered on her wineglass. "He was already distant by the time I married him. You were the one who brought warmth into this house. You used to sit on the porch with me in the evenings, talk about everything. I missed that when you left." "I didn't mean to stay away so long," Ethan said, the guilt prickling beneath his ribs. "It's just, I think I resented how things were left. With him, with you. I don't blame you." Silence. Then she added barely above a whisper, "But it was lonely." Ethan felt something shift in the room, the flicker of candlelight, the way her voice trembled, the way her fingers tapped the stem of her wineglass nervously. He wanted to reach across the table. He wanted to tell her he saw her, really saw her, not as a stepmother, not as someone who used to be part of a unit that was no longer whole, but as Claire. Just Claire. A woman with laughter lines, with sadness behind her eyes, with strength he'd admired since he was 16. Instead, he cleared the plates, their fingers brushing again. This time, she didn't apologize. Later that night, Ethan stood in the hallway outside his room. Claire's door was cracked slightly, the light still on. He considered knocking, just to say goodnight, just to check in. He stepped forward, then hesitated. She spoke first, from inside. "Ethan?" He froze. "I know you're there." He stepped into the doorway. She was sitting up in bed, reading, glasses low on her nose. Her hair was down, brushing her collarbones. I wasn't trying to bother you. You're not." Silence stretched between them, taut. "I keep thinking," Claire said, placing the book down. "How strange this is. You hear? The quiet. How fast everything changed." He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "It doesn't feel real." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes I catch myself expecting him to walk in, to tell me I've overcooked the pasta, or ask where his favorite mug went. He hated when I used it for tea." She smiled sadly. "I almost missed the nagging." Ethan chuckled, but it was hollow. "You should try to get some sleep," she said after a pause. He turned to leave, then stopped. "Claire?" "Yes?" "Do you want me to stay a few more days?" She hesitated. The answer was already in her eyes. "Please don't go yet," she said. He nodded. That night, Ethan didn't sleep well. The sheets were too cold, the house too still. His thoughts kept circling the same feeling, how her voice had cracked when she asked him to stay, how her smile had reached only halfway across her face, how his pulse quickened when she looked at him for too long. He buried his face in the pillow and told himself it was just grief, that these emotions were tangled because of what they'd lost. But some part of him, buried deep, whispered that maybe, just maybe, what was building between them had been waiting there all along. The rain that night came softly, misting the windows with a gray wash as the sky bruised into twilight. Ethan sat curled on the living room floor, legs crossed beside an open box of old photographs. Claire, wrapped in one of her late husband's sweaters, lounged on the couch behind him, sipping peppermint tea. They'd spent the day finishing the last of the sorting, boxes of tax files, worn clothes bound for donation, and the endless, fragile clutter of a life that once filled this house. Now the only thing left was stillness. Ethan picked up a photo, his father and Claire on their wedding day. She looked radiant, happy. But he noticed for the first time the space between their hands, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Had that always been there? He felt her eyes on him. "Do you remember that Christmas?" Claire said, softly. "When your father bought me a vacuum and you gave me that little snow globe from the flea market." Ethan chuckled, glancing back at her. "You cried. I thought I'd done something wrong." "You did everything right," she whispered. "It was the first time I felt like someone really saw me." The words hovered. Ethan didn't know what to say. Claire leaned forward, placing her tea down. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated, then came to sit beside him on the floor. Her hands were trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I've been thinking," she said, "now that we've gone through everything, that technically, there's nothing keeping you here anymore." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know. But I'd like you to stay." He turned to face her fully. "For how long?" Claire met his eyes. Hers were wet but steady. "I don't mean just a few more days, I mean indefinitely. This house feels like a mausoleum without you. But with you here, it's different. You make this house feel like a home again." Ethan's breath caught. She looked away. "I'm not asking for something inappropriate. I need you to know that. I'm not confused about what we are. I'm not asking for a relationship in the way people would assume." She paused. "I'm asking for companionship. I'm asking you to stay, because you're the only person who sees me, who listens, who holds space for me." There was no seduction in her voice, only quiet desperation and aching truth. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his own racing heart. "Claire." She stood suddenly and walked to the fireplace. Her hand shook as she poked at the logs, even though the fire was already dancing. "When your father got sick," she said, "we stopped being partners. I became his nurse, his housekeeper, his caretaker. I can't tell you the last time he looked at me like a woman. I told myself that was love, that sacrifice and loyalty were enough. But I was so lonely. I still am. She turned to him, firelight, flickering across her features, casting shadows across her cheekbones. "You're not replacing him," she said. "I know that's not what this is. I feel like I can breathe again when you're here." Ethan walked to the hearth and sat down beside her. For a long moment they said nothing. The crackle of fire was the only sound between them. "I don't know what this is either," Ethan said finally. "But I know I've never felt more emotionally seen than when I'm with you. You've always been the one who steadied me, even when Dad wasn't around. Especially then." Claire's voice was thick. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I know. I used to think you saw me as just his wife. I didn't dare think of anything else. I didn't either. Not until—" Ethan trailed off, his voice failing. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. Her fingers, warm and trembling, closed over his. "I'm scared," she admitted, "of what people would think, of what I might feel, of confusing grief with something else. We don't have to name it," Ethan said. They sat that way for a long time, hand in hand, watching the flames dance. Her head eventually rested on his shoulder, and Ethan let his eyes close, feeling for the first time in weeks like the storm. Inside him had quieted. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, Claire whispered, "I almost kissed you the night of the funeral." Ethan didn't move. He barely breathed. "So did I," he said. She slowly pulled back from him, enough to look him in the eyes. For a moment, it was as though time held its breath. They leaned in, ever so slightly, pulled by something unspoken but deeply understood. But, just before their lips met, Claire turned her head away, eyes closing. "No," she whispered. "Let's not confuse grief for love." The moment cracked. She drew back completely, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of the sweater. "I'm sorry, that was wrong." "It wasn't," Ethan said gently. "But it doesn't have to mean something." "It's not." He stood, unsure of what came next, but knowing what he had to do. "I'll move into the guest house," he said quietly. Claire looked up, startled. "You don't have to." "I want to. It's not about running away. It's about giving us space, to feel what we feel, to grieve, to breathe, without forcing anything." She nodded, and something like relief passed over her face. "I'm not going anywhere," he added. "I just want us to do this right." Claire's lips quivered. "You really mean that?" "I do." She walked to him and for the first time in days, pulled him into a hug, not hurried or uncertain, but full-bodied and honest. Ethan closed his eyes and let himself be held, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt like the ground beneath him was solid. They didn't talk much after that. She went to bed. He went to the guest house where he sat in silence for an hour before unpacking a single bag. They didn't need to define what had happened. Not yet. But in that shared silence, that careful boundary, they'd done something much harder than surrendering to emotion. They'd chosen presence, and for now, that was enough. The first frost came early that year, dusting the grass with silver and painting the windows of the guest house in delicate crystals. Ethan had grown used to the stillness, the slow rhythm of mornings alone, evenings shared, and a presence just beyond the hedgerow that never felt intrusive. Living in the guest house offered a strange kind of comfort. He could feel Claire's nearness without the weight of proximity. She had returned to her own routines, tending to the garden, leaving tea on his porch some mornings without knocking, and inviting him to dinner without expectation. There was peace in their pattern. Some evenings they'd cook together, standing shoulder to shoulder in the warm yellow light of the kitchen. Claire would slice vegetables with her quiet precision, while Ethan stirred sauces and talked about the chapters he was writing. He'd started journaling shortly after the funeral, trying to untangle what he was feeling. But the words grew into something larger, a memoir in progress about grief, family, and emotional boundaries. It wasn't a confessional. It was a search for clarity, for a language to explain the gray space they now lived in. Claire, in her own way, was also rebuilding. She started volunteering at the local library and organizing small community events. It was subtle, but Ethan could see her reclaiming herself, no longer Mrs. Marlowe, the grieving widow, but Claire, a woman with agency, warmth, and quiet resilience. Still, the world outside their small sanctuary did not look away quietly. The neighbors noticed. They always did. Whispers began, a sideways glance at the market, a forced smile at the mailbox. Claire never acknowledged them, and Ethan didn't ask. The unspoken agreement between them was simple. This space, this bond, belonged to them. No explanation was owed to the outside world. One night, as autumn folded into winter, they lit a fire in the main house. It had been a particularly difficult week. Ethan had written a chapter that left him emotionally raw, and Claire had received a letter from one of her late husband's friends, stirring painful memories. They sat in the living room, curled into their usual places. Ethan on the rug, Claire on the couch. "You should publish it," Claire said after a long silence, referring to his manuscript. "Maybe," Ethan murmured. "If I can finish it." "You will." She reached down and tucked a stray lock of hair behind his ear. Her fingers lingered for a moment longer than necessary. He looked up. "I've stopped trying to label this," Claire said, voice low. "Whatever it is between us. It's not a relationship, it's not family, it's just real." He nodded, his chest tightening. "Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier if it were wrong." "What do you mean?" "If it were just some twisted reaction to grief or loneliness," he said. "But it isn't, and that makes it harder to deny." Claire didn't respond right away. Instead, she slid down to the floor beside him. They sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the fire. When she finally turned to him, her expression was open, vulnerable. "I used to think love had to look a certain way. Marriage, devotion, sacrifice. But maybe love is just the person who sits beside you in your ugliest moments and doesn't flinch." Ethan turned his head. "Claire," but this time she didn't turn away. She leaned in, slowly, deliberately, and kissed him. It was not passionate, not desperate. It was soft, reverent, and achingly human. When she pulled back, her eyes glistened. "That doesn't mean we change everything," she said. "We don't have to be anything more than what we already are." Ethan took her hand, kissed her knuckles. "I don't want to ruin this. I don't want to confuse love with obligation or comfort or guilt." "I know," she said. "That's why I trust you." They didn't spend the night together. After the fire burned low, Ethan returned to the guest house, his chest warm, his mind clear. There was no roadmap for what they had, only the certainty that they had both somehow found solace in the wreckage. Days passed, then weeks. They continued on, quiet dinners, garden walks, mornings reading beside one another in silence. There was a depth now, a tenderness threaded through their every interaction. But they remained careful, not out of shame, but respect. Respect for the grief that had brought them here, and for the bond they were still learning to navigate. At a town poetry reading one Sunday, Claire introduced Ethan simply as a dear friend who helped me through the hardest time of my life. And Ethan, in turn, described Claire in the acknowledgments of his manuscript as the truest companion I've ever known. They didn't owe the world more than that. On the first snow of December, Claire invited Ethan back to the main house for dinner. They lit candles, played old records, and danced barefoot in the living room, laughter rising in a place that had once held only silence. And when the music stopped, Ethan held her in his arms, not as a son to a stepmother, not as a man to a widow, but simply as two souls who had weathered the storm and chosen to stay. There were no labels, just love as it was, quiet, unshaped, and honest. I never expected to stay. That first night I returned home, the house felt like a museum, quiet, full of ghosts, and cold in places I didn't know could hold a chill. I told myself I'd help Claire sort through the legal documents, say my goodbyes to the house, and be gone by the end of the week. But time works differently when you're mourning. Days blur. Conversations deepen. Silences stretch, not uncomfortably, but with the weight of shared memory. At some point, the grief stopped feeling like an intruder. It became a quiet companion, and in its presence, something unexpected grew. Claire. Not my stepmother, not Dad's wife. Just Claire. She was the person who made coffee in the morning with trembling hands but still offered me the first cup. She was the one who laughed at memories I barely remembered, and who cried without shame when sorting through my father's old books. She didn't try to be strong all the time. She was real, fragile, and resilient in equal measure. There were days I watched her in the garden, brushing soil from her hands, tucking stray curls behind her ears, and I felt something bloom in me that I didn't want to name. Not then, maybe not even now, because naming it would make it fit into something neat, something explainable, and this, whatever this is between us, has never been neat. Grief dismantles you. It takes the scaffolding of who you thought you were and pulls it apart piece by piece. I was a son returning home. I became a man who didn't know where he belonged, and somehow in the quiet moments spent beside her, I began to feel rebuilt. She didn't ask me to be anything. She didn't expect me to fill the space my father left behind. But she let me sit in that space with her. And we learned, together, that sometimes it's not about fixing the emptiness. It's about making peace with it. We live simply now. Separate but close. Sharing dinners, laughter, the occasional kiss when the world outside feels far enough away not to notice. Some might say it's strange. Some might say it's wrong. But the truth is, nothing about this feels forced or artificial. It's not a rebellion. It's not a fantasy. It's the slow, careful rebuilding of two lives that collided in loss and found comfort in each other. I don't know what happens next. We've made no promises. There are no plans written in stone. But I'm not running anymore. Not from her, not from this house, and not from the confusion that once scared me. Because in the quiet moments, when the tea's gone cold and the fire crackles low, I feel peace. Some bonds defy definition, not because they're wrong, but because they are built in the silence left behind by loss.